When the terminated employee made threats against the manufacturing plant, most security guards would have filed a report and increased patrols. But Tony Ricci immediately began implementing threat assessment protocols with the precision of someone who had spent 10 years as a Secret Service agent, revealing that their factory security wasn't just a guard. He was a former federal protection specialist whose workplace violence prevention training had been tested in the most high-stakes environments. Tony Ricci had been working security at Midwest Manufacturing for 5 years, and in that time he'd become more than just a guard. He'd become a trusted part of the industrial community. The plant employed 800 workers across 3 shifts, producing automotive components for major manufacturers throughout the region. It was honest work that provided good jobs for families who had built their lives around steady employment and union benefits. At 52, Tony carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who understood both the dignity of manufacturing work and the complexities of managing large groups of people under pressure. Medium height, solid build, and the kind of steady presence that made workers feel secure without creating an atmosphere of surveillance. He wore his uniform with professional pride and moved through the plant with the methodical awareness of someone who understood that industrial security was about protecting both people and production. The factory itself was typical of American manufacturing: massive machinery, complex production lines, and the constant activity of skilled workers who took pride in building products that kept the economy moving. The work was demanding, the schedules were rigid, and the safety requirements were extensive. But it was also the kind of place where families had worked for generations, where union membership meant something, and where people understood the value of honest labor. What made Tony different from typical industrial security was his understanding of how human behavior patterns indicated potential violence, especially in high-stress work environments. While other guards focused on theft prevention and safety violations, Tony found himself automatically assessing stress indicators, monitoring interpersonal conflicts, and recognizing the warning signs that could predict when workplace disputes might escalate to dangerous levels. The problem had started 3 weeks ago when Danny Martinez, a 15-year employee in the machining department, had been terminated for repeated safety violations and confrontational behavior toward supervisors. The termination had been handled by the book: progressive discipline, union representation, and proper documentation. But Martinez had made statements during his exit that concerned both management and his former co-workers. The threats weren't specific enough to warrant police involvement, but they were concerning enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Martinez had told his supervisor that people would pay for treating him unfairly, and had mentioned that he knew where everyone worked and when they were most vulnerable. To most people, these seemed like angry statements from a disgruntled former employee, but Tony recognized them as indicators of potential targeted violence. Tony began conducting what he privately called a threat assessment, using methodologies that weren't part of standard industrial security but were essential for understanding when workplace conflicts posed genuine dangers. He reviewed Martinez's employment history, analyzed his behavioral patterns during the progressive discipline process, and evaluated his access to both the facility and information about employee schedules and security procedures. The profile that emerged was troubling. Martinez had a history of blaming others for his problems, had never accepted responsibility for the safety violations that led to his termination, and had demonstrated escalating anger toward specific supervisors and co-workers. More concerning, he had detailed knowledge of plant operations, shift schedules, and security vulnerabilities that could be used to plan targeted attacks. Tony's Secret Service training had taught him that workplace violence rarely occurred without warning signs, but those signs were often missed by people who didn't understand the psychology of targeted violence. Martinez was exhibiting classic pre-attack indicators: grievance collection, blame externalization, and research into target vulnerabilities. The combination suggested someone who was moving from anger toward action planning. But Tony had to be careful about how he addressed the situation. If he approached this as a former federal agent, he would create legal and administrative complications that could interfere with effective intervention. Martinez hadn't committed any crimes, and his statements, while concerning, weren't specific enough to justify police action. The situation required the kind of subtle threat management that protected everyone involved while preventing escalation. Over the next week, Tony implemented a protective intelligence operation while maintaining his routine security duties. He coordinated with plant supervisors to monitor any attempts by Martinez to contact current employees. He reviewed security camera footage to check for surveillance of the facility, and he developed contingency plans for responding to various threat scenarios without alarming the workforce or creating a siege mentality. The intelligence gathering revealed that Martinez was indeed conducting surveillance of the plant. Security cameras captured him driving past the facility during shift changes, apparently studying employee movement patterns and security presence. Former co-workers reported that he had been asking questions about current production schedules and which supervisors were working which shifts. Most concerning, Martinez had been researching the backgrounds of specific supervisors and coworkers, using social media to gather information about their families, home addresses, and daily routines. This kind of intelligence gathering was a classic indicator that someone was moving from general grievance towards specific targeting of individuals they blamed for their problems. Tony's federal training had taught him that effective threat management required understanding the subject's mindset and decision-making process. Martinez wasn't just angry. He was developing a grievance narrative that justified violence against people he perceived as responsible for his problems. The surveillance and research indicated someone who was planning rather than just venting frustration. But the situation also presented an opportunity for intervention. Martinez hadn't yet committed to a specific plan of action, which meant there was still time for de-escalation techniques that could redirect his focus away from violence and toward more constructive resolution of his grievances. Tony's breakthrough came when he realized that Martinez's behavior pattern matched threat indicators that warranted federal attention. The combination of surveillance, intelligence gathering, and targeting of specific individuals suggested someone who posed a genuine risk not just to the plant, but to the broader community of workers and their families. Tony contacted his former supervisor at the Secret Service, Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, who now managed threat assessment cases for the agency's Protective Intelligence Division. The Secret Service had expanded their mission beyond presidential protection to include workplace violence prevention, especially cases involving federal employees or facilities with government contracts. Tony, this behavioral pattern is exactly what we've been tracking in workplace violence cases, Agent Walsh explained during their secure phone conversation. The surveillance, research, and targeting indicators suggest someone who's moved beyond anger into operational planning. We need to intervene before he commits to a specific course of action. The Secret Service wanted Tony to continue his security work while serving as a protective intelligence asset for their threat assessment team. He would monitor Martinez's activities, document any escalation in threatening behavior, and coordinate with federal agents to develop intervention strategies that could prevent violence without creating legal complications for the plant or its employees. The approach required careful balance. Too little intervention, and Martinez might escalate to violence. Too much intervention, and the aggressive response might actually trigger the violence they were trying to prevent. Tony's experience with high-stakes threat management made him uniquely qualified to navigate this balance while protecting everyone involved. The intervention began with what the Secret Service called soft disruption, actions designed to interrupt Martinez's planning process without directly confronting him or escalating his anger. Tony coordinated with local police to increase patrol presence around the plant, making it clear that the facility was under closer law enforcement scrutiny without specifically targeting Martinez. The plant's security procedures were enhanced in ways that appeared routine but specifically addressed the vulnerabilities that Martinez might exploit. Shift change protocols were modified to reduce predictable patterns. Access control was tightened to prevent unauthorized entry. And employee awareness training was conducted to help workers recognize and report suspicious behavior without creating a climate of fear. Most importantly, Tony worked with the plant's employee assistance program to reach out to Martinez through his union representative, offering counseling services and job placement assistance that might address his underlying grievances without acknowledging the threat concerns. This approach provided Martinez with constructive alternatives while demonstrating that the company was willing to help rather than simply punish. The strategy also included protective measures for the specific supervisors and coworkers that Martinez had been researching. Without revealing the full scope of the threat assessment, security recommendations were made for their personal safety, including changes to their daily routines and increased awareness of their surroundings. The situation escalated when Martinez attempted to enter the plant during the night shift, claiming he had forgotten personal items in his former work area. The attempt was unsuccessful due to the enhanced security procedures, but his behavior during the encounter revealed significant deterioration in his emotional state and decision-making capability. Security cameras captured Martinez becoming increasingly agitated when denied entry, making statements about getting what was owed to him and making sure people understood the consequences of their actions. More concerning, he had brought a large duffel bag and had been observed sitting in his vehicle in the parking lot for over an hour before approaching the security checkpoint. Tony immediately activated the threat response protocol he had developed with federal agents. Martinez was not confronted or detained, which could have escalated his anger, but his activities were documented and reported to the Secret Service Threat Assessment Team. Law enforcement presence around the facility was increased, and key personnel were notified about the heightened security concerns. The incident represented a critical escalation in Martinez's behavior pattern. The attempt to gain unauthorized access, combined with his emotional state and the presence of a large bag, suggested someone who was moving from planning toward action. Tony's threat assessment training indicated that immediate intervention was necessary to prevent potential violence. The Secret Service coordinated a multi-agency response that included local police, mental health professionals, and the plant's management team. The goal was to interrupt Martinez's planning process through direct but non-confrontational intervention that addressed his grievances while ensuring community safety. Tony's role during the intervention was to provide real-time intelligence on plant operations and employee safety, while maintaining his cover as routine security until federal agents were ready for direct action. His understanding of both the facility's vulnerabilities and Martinez's behavior patterns was essential for ensuring the intervention succeeded without endangering workers or escalating the threat. The intervention began with a welfare check conducted by local police and mental health professionals at Martinez's residence. The approach was designed to appear routine while allowing assessment of his current mental state and any preparations he might have made for violent action. Tony coordinated with federal agents to ensure they had complete situational awareness of plant operations during the intervention. The results were significant. Martinez was found to have detailed plans for accessing the plant, maps of employee parking areas, and information about specific individuals he blamed for his termination. Mental health evaluation revealed severe depression and escalating anger that had progressed to the point where violence seemed like a reasonable solution to his problems. The aftermath of the federal intervention revealed Tony's role to his shocked colleagues and plant management. The reliable factory security guard who had handled everything from theft prevention to safety violations was actually a former Secret Service special agent whose threat assessment expertise had prevented what could have been a devastating workplace violence incident. Plant manager Sarah Chen was the first to understand the scope of what had happened. "Tony, you've been conducting a federal threat assessment for weeks while handling routine security duties," she said during the post-incident briefing. "You prevented a potential tragedy that could have destroyed our entire community." Union Representative Mike Thompson struggled to process how the security guard he'd worked with for 5 years had managed such a complex threat intervention. "Tony, you saved people's lives without anyone even knowing they were in danger. How did you recognize what the rest of us missed?" "That's exactly why it worked," Tony explained to the assembled group of managers, supervisors, and union representatives. "If I had approached this as a former federal agent, it would have created legal complications and might have escalated Martinez's anger. But as a security guard with good observational skills, I could conduct threat assessment and coordinate with federal resources without triggering the defensive reactions that complicate intervention." Agent Walsh arrived at the plant to personally thank Tony for his work and to address concerns about future workplace safety. "Special Agent Ricci's threat assessment work was textbook protective intelligence," she announced. "His understanding of workplace violence indicators and his position within the plant community allowed us to prevent a targeted attack that could have resulted in multiple casualties." In the weeks following the intervention, the manufacturing plant implemented comprehensive workplace violence prevention protocols based on Tony's recommendations and Secret Service best practices. The changes went beyond simple security measures to include employee assistance programs, conflict resolution training, and early intervention systems that could identify and address workplace grievances before they escalated to dangerous levels. Tony worked with plant management and union leadership to develop threat assessment protocols that could be implemented by security personnel and supervisors without requiring federal law enforcement backgrounds. The training emphasized recognition of warning signs, de-escalation techniques, and coordination with mental health resources that could address underlying problems rather than just responding to symptoms. The Secret Service offered Tony positions with federal protective details and threat assessment teams investigating similar workplace violence cases. But Tony had discovered something important during his 5 years at the manufacturing plant. He genuinely valued the community relationships and daily interactions that came with industrial security work. "I spent 10 years with the Secret Service protecting high-profile individuals," Tony explained to Agent Walsh when she offered him a return to federal service. "But I've spent 5 years here protecting working families who depend on this plant for their livelihoods. Both kinds of protection matter, but this feels more like community service than law enforcement." Tony decided to stay with the manufacturing plant, but with an expanded role that recognized his expertise. The company hired him as Director of Workplace Safety and Security, responsible for developing threat assessment protocols for their entire network of manufacturing facilities throughout the region. The Secret Service maintained Tony as a consultant, available for cases where his specific expertise in workplace violence prevention could make a difference. But his primary focus remained on the kind of community protection work that prevented violence rather than just responding to it after people had been hurt. Local law enforcement worked with Tony to develop workplace violence prevention programs that could be implemented at other industrial facilities facing similar challenges. His protocols for recognizing threat indicators, managing employee grievances, and coordinating with federal resources became models for workplace security throughout the manufacturing sector. 2 years later, Tony had transformed workplace security operations at manufacturing facilities across the metropolitan area. His protocols for threat assessment, employee support, and federal coordination had prevented numerous potential workplace violence incidents while maintaining the kind of positive work environment that allowed productive labor relationships to flourish. More importantly, Tony had demonstrated that effective workplace security required understanding human behavior well enough to prevent violence, not just responding after threats had already escalated to dangerous levels. His approach combined federal threat assessment expertise with genuine understanding of industrial work environments and the economic pressures that could drive people toward desperate actions. The manufacturing plant itself had become a model for workplace violence prevention in industrial settings. Labor relations experts pointed to it as an example of successful threat management that protected both worker safety and productive business operations. Federal agencies used it for training exercises on community-based threat assessment. Detective Maria Rodriguez, who had worked with Tony throughout the federal intervention, often brought new officers to the plant for training. "This is what professional workplace security looks like," she would tell them, not just watching for theft and safety violations, but understanding human behavior well enough to prevent violence before it destroys communities. Tony Ricci continues his security work at Midwest Manufacturing, but everyone in the plant community now understands that their Director of Workplace Safety brings something unique to his role. He's the former Secret Service special agent who chose industrial security over federal career advancement, who understands that protecting working families is just as important as protecting high-profile government officials. His story reminds us that expertise developed in federal service doesn't end when someone leaves government employment. It continues in new forms of community protection that may be less dramatic, but are equally valuable to the people whose daily lives are made safer by that expertise. Sometimes the person ensuring safety at an American manufacturing plant carries training from the Secret Service's most elite threat assessment units, quietly preventing workplace violence with skills developed protecting the nation's highest officials. These are the professionals who understand that true security comes not from responding to violence after it happens, but from recognizing and interrupting the behavioral patterns that lead to targeted attacks. Tony's choice to remain in industrial security work rather than return to federal service represents something important about protection: that keeping people safe doesn't require federal authority or high-profile assignments. Sometimes the most valuable service happens quietly in everyday workplaces, provided by professionals whose expertise ensures that honest work can continue without fear. The next time you visit a manufacturing facility and notice the security professional who seems particularly observant and skilled at managing people, remember Tony's story. That person might just be someone whose background in federal protection continues to serve and protect, one workplace community at a time.